The post office at Netherwicken occupied the ground floor of a narrow Georgian building on the village's only-through road, and it smelled, as it had smelled for as long as anyone could remember, of beeswax, old paper, and the particular brand of digestive biscuit that Iris Fellows kept in a tin beside the till. The tea-room portion. 3 tables, 6 mismatched chairs, a blackboard listing 2 options, was separated from the postal counter by nothing more than a change in the quality of the light, the counter side being dim and practical, the tea-room side catching the last of the afternoon sun through a south-facing window that Iris had never got round to cleaning properly. This gave the tea-room a soft, slightly amber quality in the late afternoons, as though everything observed through it had already been preserved. Miss Marple found it entirely agreeable. She had been in Netherwicken for 4 days, which was long enough to have established herself as a regular at Iris's 3 o'clock sitting, long enough also to have been assessed, classified, and largely dismissed by the village as Phillida Salt's elderly friend from St. Mary Mead, harmless, curious about gardens, and unlikely to stay past the end of October. This suited Miss Marple very well. One could observe a great deal from a position of harmlessness. "More hot water," said Iris, arriving with a small jug that she set down with the particular emphasis of someone who considers the request an imposition but grants it anyway. Iris Fellows was 81, had run the post office since the death of her husband 30 years ago, and had the face of a woman who had spent 3 decades being the first person in the village to know everything and the last to admit it. She had a way of sitting down at a customer's table, in the slow period mid-afternoon, that suggested she was conferring a favor rather than seeking company. Miss Marple, who recognized this particular arrangement of social power immediately, had from the first treated Iris's attentions as the valuable intelligence-gathering opportunities they were. "You're very kind," Miss Marple said, pouring. "I always find the second cup is the one that actually settles the afternoon." Iris sat. "You been out to the pond yet?" "Phillida takes everyone to the pond. We walked that way yesterday. Very lovely. The reeds are quite extraordinary this time of year." Iris turned her cup on its saucer with a small rotating motion that indicated she was about to say something she had decided to say approximately 40 seconds ago. "Seen the man who came into the village Tuesday, staying at the Lamb." Miss Marple had not seen him, but she had heard about him from Phillida that morning at breakfast, mentioned in the careful tone Phillida used, when she wished to seem as though she were not raising a subject. "A solicitor, I understand? From Bristol? Leonard Peck." Iris said the name with the weight of someone producing a document. "His sister drowned in that pond. 1974. Before your time here, obviously before most people's time. She lodged with Sylvia Capel. The nurse, the retired one, the cottage on Butter Lane, for 3 years or thereabouts. Did botanical drawings. Rosalind, her name was. What a sad thing. It was. She was ill, apparently, that came out at the inquest. Accidental, they said. She'd gone walking in the evening and gone too close to the bank, and she wasn't strong." Iris said this precisely, in the tone of someone reciting a version they had memorized rather than believed. "She was a particular sort of woman, Rosalind Peck. Neither of them made a fuss, her and Sylvia. That was what you noticed about them together. Very self-contained. Sylvia would have approved of her." This observation, made in passing as Iris straightened a sugar bowl that did not need straightening, caught the edge of Miss Marple's attention in a way that she noted and set aside. For later, the way one sets aside a piece of a puzzle that doesn't yet have an obvious place. "And the brother has come back now," Miss Marple said, "after all this time, asking questions at the hall." Iris's voice was neutral in the specific way that indicated strong feeling. "Their mother died in the spring, apparently." He found something among her things. Letter, they're saying, though nobody's seen it." She paused. "I don't say there's anything wrong with asking questions. I only say that 50 years is 50 years, and the people who were here then are old now, and it isn't a comfortable thing, being asked to remember." She stood up, with the air of a woman who has completed a transaction, and went back to her counter. Miss Marple sat with her tea and looked out through the amber-tinted window at the high street, which was quiet at this hour. A woman walking a terrier, a car moving slowly toward the junction, two men outside the Lamb, engaged in the particular posture of conversation that meant they were discussing something neither of them would admit to finding interesting. She thought about 1974. She thought about botanical illustrations. She thought about the word Iris had used, self-contained, and the quiet specificity with which she'd applied it to both women together rather than to either one alone. She thought about the fact that in Miss Marple's experience, accidental deaths in small villages were frequently accidental and occasionally something else entirely, and that the difference between the two was often nothing more than a question nobody had thought to ask at the time. The door opened, and Phillida came in with her coat still buttoned, and her expression arranged in the careful, slightly too casual manner that meant she had news. "Jane," she said, sitting down quickly and reaching for the second cup Iris had not yet cleared. "That man, Leonard Peck. I've just spoken to him outside the Lamb. He's been at the hall all morning, talking to the administrator about records from before it was a care home, and he asked me." She paused. "He asked me whether there was anyone in the village who might remember things clearly. From that time—" "And you told him?" Miss Marple said. "I told him," Phillida said, with the faint air of someone who has just made a decision they are not entirely sure about, "that you were very good at remembering things." Miss Marple looked out at the high street again. The two men outside the Lamb had gone in. The woman with the terrier had reached the corner. The light through Iris's window was going golden now, the way it did at this hour, thickening everything it touched into something that resembled permanence. "How very kind," she said, and finished her tea. Leonard Peck was not what Miss Marple had expected, which meant she had been constructing expectations without realizing it. Always a useful thing to notice about oneself. She had expected, she supposed, someone agitated. A man who had spent 50 years picking at the edges of his sister's death would carry that picking somewhere visible, in the hands, or the eyes, or the particular over-careful quality of speech that came from having rehearsed a subject too many times. Leonard Peck had none of this. He was 61, solidly built, with the steady, unhurried manner of a solicitor, accustomed to the long view of things. And when Phillida introduced him in her sitting room that evening, he stood and shook Miss Marple's hand, and said he was glad to meet her with the simple directness of a man who had decided to trust someone and was getting on with it. "Phillida tells me you're observant," he said, when they were all seated and Phillida had produced sherry she'd been keeping for an occasion that had not previously arisen. "Phillida is generous," Miss Marple said. "I am simply old, and old people notice things because they have run out of reasons not to." This made him smile briefly. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced an envelope. Not new, the paper gone slightly soft with handling, and held it for a moment before setting it on the table between them. "My mother died in April," he said. "She was 93 and entirely herself until the last week, which was a mercy. When we cleared her house in Cheltenham, I found this in the lining of a writing case. Not hidden, exactly. More, put somewhere safe and then forgotten. The way things are when you're very old and safe places become simply places." He opened the envelope and produced a letter of 2 pages, handwritten in a small, very precise script. He did not offer it to Miss Marple directly. He read from it instead, in the measured tone of someone who has read a passage sufficiently many times that the reading has separated itself from the feeling. This is from Rosalind. 3 weeks before she died, she writes, "This is partway through. I know you'll worry, but I want you to understand that I am not as frightened as I was. Doctor Melville in Cheltenham says 8 months, perhaps a little more, but I have found that I do not want to go quickly. I have a reason to stay, and I am going to stay as long as I am able. And I would like very much for you to come and see me in October, when the wild flowers are finished and we can sit inside properly." He stopped. "She died on the 14th of September. My mother received the letter on the 17th and kept it for 76 years. The room was quiet. Outside, the October wind moved through the lime tree at the end of Phillida's garden with a sound like turning pages. October never came," Phillida said softly, "because she was the sort of person who felt silences needed filling." Miss Marple did not feel this, but she let it pass. "Your mother never went to the inquest?" she asked. "She did. She heard the verdict, accidental, consistent with illness, and she said nothing about the letter because she believed it. She had no reason not to. Women in poor health did fall. The bank was steep. It was evening. He folded the letter back along its creases. I believed it too for a long time. What changed was, I became a solicitor. I spent 40 years reading documents carefully, and the older I got, the more the inquest record troubled me. Not any single thing. The shape of it, the position of the body," Miss Marple said. He looked at her directly. "Phillida said you were observant. She didn't say you were quick. I'm not quick. I've simply been thinking about it since this afternoon." She set down her sherry glass. "Iris Fellows mentioned the pond, the bank, and then you arrived with a letter establishing that your sister intended to be alive in October. These two things are not comfortable together." Leonard was quiet for a moment. "Then, the bank she'd have gone in from. The path runs along the north side. That's where people walk, where she would have walked. The body was found on the south side of the pond, 80 feet away. There was no wind that night. She was fully dressed. The inquest noted it and called it consistent with how bodies move in still water, and the coroner in 1974 was not a man who liked complications." He paused. "I don't know what happened. I know something was wrong." Miss Marple thought of Iris saying neither of them made a fuss, her and Sylvia, and of the particular way that observation had arrived, attached to nothing, leading nowhere, volunteered by a woman who did not volunteer things without purpose. "Tell me about the woman your sister lodged with," she said. "Sylvia Capel." Something shifted in Leonard's expression. Not guilt and not suspicion, but the look of a man setting down a weight he has carried for a long time without being entirely sure what it contained. "They were close, closer than I understood at the time. Rosalind wasn't. She didn't write about her feelings easily. But the letters from those 3 years in Nether Wicken were different from everything before. Lighter." He turned his glass in his hands. "After Rosalind died, Sylvia wrote to my mother once. A single letter. My mother described it as the letter of someone who had lost the most important thing. She kept that too, but it wasn't in the writing case. I haven't found it. And Sylvia Capel is still in the village, Butter Lane. Yes." Phillida, who had been quiet for some minutes with the expression of someone trying to decide whether to contribute, said, "I called on her, briefly, last week. She knew who I was. She knows everyone who has family at the hall. She was perfectly civil. She made tea." Miss Marple said, "She made tea. Yes, immediately, the moment I came in. Before I'd even sat down." "Yes," Miss Marple said, as though this confirmed something, though she did not say what. "I would very much like to call on Miss Capel tomorrow, if that can be arranged naturally." "I could take you," Phillida offered. I have a reason to go. Her son mentioned last week that she'd been having some trouble with her garden gate, and Gerald at the hall has tools. It would be perfectly ordinary." "Perfectly ordinary is exactly right," Miss Marple said. She picked up her sherry again and looked at the window, which showed nothing now but the dark and the faint reflection of Phillida's lamp. She thought about a woman who made tea before her guests had sat down. She thought about a reason to stay. The phrase sitting in the letter like a small stone in a shoe, present and insistent. She thought about the particular quality of love that expressed itself as certainty rather than question, that moved always toward resolution rather than asking what the other person needed. She had known a woman like that once in St. Mary Mead, a woman who had loved her bedridden mother with absolute devotion and absolute conviction simultaneously, who had relayed her mother's wishes to other people and somehow never quite enacted them, because the wishes that arrived from her mother had always passed through the filter of what she, the devoted daughter, believed her mother truly needed. The mother had died wanting particular things. She had died without them, and the daughter had grieved with perfect sincerity, because in her own account of events she had done everything right. The mother had wanted a window left open. The daughter had believed night air was dangerous. The mother had wanted her old friend Mrs. Somebody from Cirencester to visit. The daughter had believed the excitement would overtax her. Such small things, such confident, loving substitutions. Miss Marple had never been able to say whether Mrs. Forrest had known what she was doing. She had suspected finally that Mrs. Forrest had not, that the gap between her mother's expressed wishes and her own enacted decisions had never once appeared to her as a gap at all. That was the specific and rather terrible thing about a certain kind of love. It consumed the space where doubt would otherwise live. She did not share any of this with Leonard Peck or with Phillida. There was nothing to share yet, only a shape, the way a figure in fog is a shape before it is a person. 10 o'clock tomorrow, she said. For the gate. Wickenhall had been, in its previous life, a moderately handsome early Victorian country house of the sort built by families with new money and old aspirations, the proportions slightly too large for warmth, the stonework slightly too pale for the Gloucestershire landscape, as though the original architect had been working from an idea of a country house, rather than from any specific affection for the country. As a residential care home, it had been neither improved nor worsened by its conversion. The formal rooms had become communal lounges with institutional carpeting laid over the original floors, and the bedrooms had been subdivided and made practical, and the whole had acquired that particular institutional smell. Cleaning fluid and warm food and something underneath both, like old wood slowly releasing 50 years of absorbed weather, that announced itself on the front step before you were properly through the door. Visiting hours ran Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, 2 until 4:30. Phillida's brother Arthur occupied a room on the first floor overlooking the kitchen garden, a small, precise man of 78 who had been a cartographer and still kept ordnance survey maps pinned to the wall above his bed as though triangulating his position in the world. Miss Marple liked him immediately. He had the quality she had always found reassuring in people who worked with precise measurements, a settled relationship with the facts of things, an absence of the need to make them larger. She sat with Phillida and Arthur for 20 minutes, and then excused herself on the grounds of finding the room warm, which was true, and explored the communal lounge at the end of the corridor, which was her actual purpose. The lounge contained, at this hour, 4 residents in various configurations of wakefulness, a staff member doing something administrative at a small desk by the window, and Geoffrey Harker. He was not a resident. He was sitting in one of the visitors' chairs beside a woman Miss Marple did not recognize. A resident, clearly small and folded into herself with age, who appeared to be asleep despite Geoffrey's presence. Geoffrey himself was not sitting in the way one sits beside a sleeping companion. He was sitting in the way one sits when one is waiting for something to be over. He was 72, and he had been a large man who was now slightly less so, the way men of a certain type contracted with age rather than softened. He had good shoes and a wax jacket, and the face of someone who had spent a lifetime exercising a particular kind of authority, and was now required to exercise it only over himself. He was not doing this successfully. His hands on the arms of the chair were doing something that was not quite still. Miss Marple took the chair 2 along from him on the other side of a small table bearing a vase of carnations past their best, and said, "Aren't the carnations looking tired? I always think carnations are the bravest flowers. They persist so long after they ought to have given up." Geoffrey Harker looked at her. He had the assessing look of a man who had spent his career evaluating property and had never quite stopped applying the same process to people. Whatever he concluded about Miss Marple, it relaxed him fractionally. "My aunt," he said, nodding toward the sleeping woman. "She sleeps most afternoons now. I come anyway. How kind." Miss Marple looked at the carnations. "You're Mr. Harker, I think. Phillida Salt mentioned you. I'm her friend, Jane Marple, just visiting for a few weeks. She mentioned me. Only in the way one learns the geography of a village. Your wife does ceramics, she told me. I admire anyone with a craft." This was the right thing to say. The hands on the chair arms settled. "Nora, yes. She's built quite a following. Sells through a gallery in Cirencester." "How satisfying," Miss Marple said. "To make something that lasts." She said it simply, without emphasis, and watched Geoffrey receive it. Something moved across his face, a thought he did not complete, a connection he did not pursue. And then it was gone. They sat in the mild, slightly deflating silence of the communal lounge. Somewhere down the corridor, a television was producing the sound of an afternoon quiz program. The staff member at the desk turned a page. "I understand there's a visitor in the village," Miss Marple said presently. "Asking about something that happened here long ago. I hope it isn't causing distress." Geoffrey's hands did the thing again. "Leonard Peck," he said. The name arrived in his mouth with the quality of something he had been trying not to say, and had now said. "His sister drowned 50 years ago. He has questions. Quite natural, I should think." "Natural," he said the word carefully. "He was a boy when it happened. 11, 12. You can carry something a long time at that age and not know what it is. And now he's come to find out." "There's nothing to find out." He said this with a precision that was not quite conviction. "It was an accident. She was ill. It was evening. She fell. The inquest said so." "Of course," Miss Marple said. Geoffrey looked at her sidelong, with the expression of a man who has just been agreed with in a way that feels entirely unlike agreement. Before he could respond, the door to the lounge opened, and Constable Morrow came in, young, perhaps 28, with the slightly uncomfortable bearing of a local officer required to do something that was not quite a proper investigation, but was not quite not one either. Behind him was Nora Harker, brisk and dry-eyed, wearing an expression that had clearly been arranged before she came through the door. "Geoffrey," she said, "the constable would like a word. I said you'd be here." Geoffrey stood. He was taller standing than Miss Marple had expected, and the largeness came back to him with the vertical. He looked for a moment like a man preparing to be accused of something, which was, Miss Marple reflected, slightly different from a man preparing to be questioned. "Mrs. Harker," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "your husband has been telling me about your ceramics. I do hope I might see your work before I leave." Nora Harker stopped and looked at Miss Marple with the sharp attention of someone who has just encountered an unexpected obstacle on a familiar path. "Of course," she said after a brief pause. "Any afternoon." They left Geoffrey, Nora, and the young constable in the particular procession of people who are trying to look as though nothing of significance is happening and succeeding only approximately. Miss Marple watched them go. The sleeping aunt had not woken through any of this. From behind her, a voice said, "He won't tell them anything useful, you know." She turned. A man was leaning in the doorway that led to the far corridor. 47 or so, solidly built, with the careful eyes of someone who had grown up learning to read atmospheres. He had a paper coffee cup in one hand, and the look of a man who had been standing there long enough to have heard most of the preceding conversation. "Martin Capel," he said, coming in properly and sitting down across from her with the ease of someone who has decided to do a thing and sees no reason to be tentative about it. "My mother is Sylvia Capel. I visit once a month." He paused. "I know who you are, Mrs. Salt's friend. I know why Leonard Peck is here." "Then you know more than most," Miss Marple said. "I know about Rosalind Peck." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. Not Geoffrey's anxious motion, but the rotating thought of someone working something out in real time. "She and my mother were close. Before I was born, during the first years of my life. She died when I was 3. I don't remember her, but I grew up with the space she'd left, if that makes sense. My mother's house has never not had her in it somehow. That is a very particular kind of presence." "Yes," he was quiet for a moment. "My mother doesn't talk about her. Never has. But she keeps things. She never throws anything away, my mother." The hall cupboard alone. He stopped and smiled briefly at something private. "If Rosalind Peck left any trace of herself in this village, it is in that cupboard, I'd imagine, in among 40 years of nursing notebooks and correspondence, and Lord knows what else." He said it lightly, the way one makes a gentle observation about an endearing characteristic. The information arrived without apparent intention, as naturally as weather. Miss Marple received it with equal naturalness, nodding once, as though this were the sort of thing one noted and moved on from. "Your mother must have found these weeks difficult," she said, "with Mr. Peck in the village asking questions." Martin Capel's expression did something complicated. "She hasn't said so, but she's been very quiet, even for her." He stood, cup still in hand. "I should get back to her. I just wanted to." He paused. "I don't know what I wanted, actually. I think I wanted someone to know that whatever happened 50 years ago, my mother is not a woman who does things lightly. Whatever she did or didn't do." He left before Miss Marple could reply. Which was, she supposed, the point. She sat alone in the lounge with the tired carnations and the sleeping aunt and the sound of the quiz program from down the hall. And she thought about hall cupboards. She thought about nursing notebooks. She thought about a man who had just in the space of 4 minutes both defended his mother and told a stranger where to look. She thought people were very rarely as opaque as they believed themselves to be. The path to Wicken Pond ran east from the village along a public footpath that followed the line of an old field boundary. Hawthorn on one side, gone dark and thorny with the season, a drainage ditch on the other filled with the last of the autumn water. The ground underfoot was soft, but not treacherous, and the walk from the village took perhaps 12 minutes at Miss Marple's pace, which Leonard Peck matched without appearing to adjust himself, the way considerate people do. He had called at Phillida's cottage that morning with the diffident air of a man who wishes to ask something and has decided that directness is less painful than approach. He wished to show Miss Marple the pond. He wished, she understood, to show it to someone who would look at it properly. The day was pale and still, the kind of October day that feels like held breath. No wind, a sky, the color of old pewter, the trees in that final suspended moment before the cold makes its decision and the leaves commit to falling. Miss Marple walked with her stick and looked at everything. "It's further than I imagined," she said. When the hawthorn opened and the path descended slightly toward the flat ground where the pond sat among its reeds. "She walked it regularly," Leonard said, "even when she was ill. My mother worried about that, the letters say, worried about Rosalind going out alone in the evenings. Rosalind told her she needed the air and she was perfectly capable of managing a footpath. Yes, she sounds like someone who did not enjoy being managed. She was the least manageable person I knew." He said this with a fondness that had nothing elegiac about it, the direct fondness of someone describing a quality they admired rather than mourning one they'd lost. "She once told our father, when she was 17, that his opinion on her future was welcome but not required. He was furious. She was absolutely serious." They reached the edge of the pond. It was perhaps 40 meters across at its widest, narrowing at the eastern end where the reeds grew thickest. The water was dark and very still, reflecting the pewter sky so accurately that the surface seemed less like water than like an opening, a place where the sky continued downward. The north bank, where the path ran, was bordered by a low wooden fence that had been replaced at some point. In the last 20 years, the posts knew enough to still hold their shape. The south bank was less managed. No fence, the ground dropping more steeply to the water's edge, the reeds crowding in from both sides. Miss Marple stood and looked at the south bank for a considerable time. "The path," she said. "One walks along the north side only. Yes, there's no path on the south. The ground is waterlogged from about March onward, and even in September it's soft. You'd know you were off the path immediately. And the bank itself, the angle of it, steeper than the north. The ground drops perhaps 4 feet and 10 on the south side. If you went in from there, you would go in quickly." "If you went in from there," Miss Marple said carefully, "where would you expect to be found? By the action of the water, if the water were still." Leonard was quiet for a moment. He had clearly asked this question before, had lived with it, she suspected, for years. "Where you went in. Still water doesn't move a body, or moves it very little, very slowly. The body was found here." He walked 6 or 7 paces to his right along the north bank and indicated a point where the fence was oldest, the wood dark with moisture. "The reeds here. Caught in the reeds. But if she'd gone in from the north bank path, she'd have been found here." He had stopped. He was not looking at the water. He was looking at the fence post as though it owed him something. "Or near here. Within a few feet. Not 80 feet away on the south side." Miss Marple looked from the north bank to the south bank. 80 feet, he had said. It was, in the stillness of the October morning, a very legible distance. Not an ambiguous distance. Not a distance one arrived at by accident in still water on a still night. "The coroner's note," she said. "You have the inquest record?" "I've had it for 20 years. The coroner wrote, 'I have it committed to memory, which tells you something about how I've spent my time. Position of the deceased consistent with movement in still water. No evidence of struggle at the bank. Clothing intact. No marks suggesting third-party involvement.' He was a general practitioner named Fenwick, who died in 1989. The senior partner at the surgery co-signed the death certificate. The junior locum countersigned." She heard something in his voice. Not bitterness, something more considered than bitterness. "There were 3 people in that room who could have asked the question I am asking now, and none of them asked it. People very rarely ask questions," Miss Marple said, "when the answer is almost certainly simple. It is only almost certainly that does the damage." She turned from the pond and looked back along the path toward the village. From here in the pale morning, the hawthorn hedge was a dark, uneven line against the sky, and beyond it the hall's upper windows were just visible, the pale stone catching what little light there was. "The wildflowers," she said, "along this path, earlier in the season. Rosalind knew every one of them by its Latin name. She'd been commissioned for a reference work, plates for a botanical survey of the county. She'd been working on it for 2 years when she died. The commission died with her." He paused. "The commissioner, a publisher in Oxford, sent a rather decent letter to my mother. He said she had an extraordinary eye for the medicinal species, that she understood plants not just visually but pharmacologically, he said, the way they worked." "Medicinal species," Miss Marple said. "Along this path? Along this path and in the gardens. She had a particular interest in the ones with dual properties, decorative and pharmaceutical. She wrote about it in her letters. She found it interesting that something could be beautiful and dangerous simultaneously." He looked at her. "She would have said that about people too, probably." Miss Marple thought of Sylvia Capel's garden. She thought of a Tropa belladonna growing very correctly against a south-facing wall. The berries already gone by October. The plant pruned back with the particular tidiness of someone who understood exactly what they were growing. She had noticed it yesterday. Noted it with the part of her mind that noted things before the rest of the mind knew why, and had thought, "Someone who grows that knows what it is." She had not yet thought past that point. She did so now, briefly, and then put it away. "The evening she died," she said. "Was anyone seen near the pond?" Leonard's expression shifted. The same complex movement she had observed the previous evening, the sense of a weight being repositioned rather than set down. Geoffrey Harker said at the time that he had been walking in that direction. He said he saw nothing. He said he turned back before the pond. He paused. "Last Tuesday, when I arrived in the village, and he saw me coming out of the hall, he said, and I don't know why he said it. I hadn't asked. We had barely exchanged 3 words. He said, 'She was already in the water when I arrived.' The stillness of the morning received this information and held it. He said it as though he'd been waiting to say it to someone," Leonard continued. "As though the sentence had been waiting in him for 50 years, and my face was the thing that released it. Then he walked away very quickly, and I haven't been able to get him to speak to me since." Miss Marple looked at the south bank. She looked at the reeds where Rosalind Peck had been found. She thought about a sentence waiting 50 years for the right face. "He said she was already in the water," she said. "Not that he found her in the water. Not that he saw her in the water from the path." She paused. "Already, that word has a before and after built into it. Already implies he knew there was a before." Leonard was very still. "He arrived at the pond," Miss Marple said quietly, "and she was there, and someone else was not. That is what already means, I think. It means he expected, or feared, that he might find something, and he found it, and whoever else he might have expected to find there was gone." The pewter sky had not changed. The water had not moved. Down in the reeds something small made a single sound and was silent again. "He knew she'd been put there," Leonard said. It was not quite a question. "I think," Miss Marple said, "that he knew something was wrong, and that he has spent 50 years constructing a reason why that knowledge required him to do nothing." She turned from the pond and began back along the path, "which is a very different thing from being the person who put her there." Leonard Peck walked beside her in silence for a long moment. Then he said, "My sister wrote that she had a reason to stay. I thought for 30 years that she meant a person." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "I imagine most people would think that. But you don't." Miss Marple considered the hawthorn hedge, the pale sky, the field beyond. "I think," she said carefully, "that your sister was a woman who did not enjoy being managed. I think that when she found she had a reason to stay, when something shifted for her, in the way things sometimes shift, she meant staying itself. Life, the unfinished work, the October she wanted to see. She paused. I think she had told someone she would not stay, and then she changed her mind. And I am not yet certain whether she had time to say so. Leonard said nothing. They walked back along the path toward the village in the pale October silence, the hawthorn on one side and the drainage ditch on the other, and behind them the pond sat perfectly still, reflecting a sky that gave nothing back. The tea-room at 3 o'clock on a Thursday was slightly fuller than usual, which meant 4 tables occupied instead of 2, and Iris Fellows moving between them with the focused efficiency of a woman who found abundance more taxing than scarcity. A retired couple from the new houses at the village's edge. A young woman with a laptop who had been coming in for a week and whom the village had not yet classified. And Nora Harker, alone at the corner table nearest the postal counter, with a cup of something she was not drinking, an expression she had brought in from outside and not yet managed to put down. Miss Marple took the window table, ordered tea and a scone she did not particularly want, and arranged herself in the manner she had perfected over many decades, the manner of a woman settled contentedly into her own company, presenting to the room a surface so unthreatening, so entirely absorbed in the pleasures of buttering, that observation became invisible within it. She had been thinking, since the pond, about the shape of the case as she now understood it. There was Leonard's body of evidence, the position, the letter, Geoffrey's sentence, and there was her own accumulation, which was of a different and less legal character. The 2 bodies of evidence were beginning to describe the same outline, the way 2 people drawing the same object from different angles produce drawings that are not identical but are clearly of the same thing. What she did not yet have was the interior, the mechanism she could construct, the opportunity she could trace. What she needed, what would determine whether the shape she was assembling was the correct shape, was the specific psychology of the person at the center of it. The question of what kind of love does this, because love was clearly what it was. She had known that since Iris said neither of them made a fuss, her and Sylvia, known it with the part of her that recognized human arrangements, the part that had spent 80 years watching the village and understanding that the deepest attachments were often the quietest ones, the ones that expressed themselves not in demonstration but in the steady daily fact of 2 people organized around each other. Sylvia Capel had loved Rosalind Peck. Miss Marple was as certain of this as she was of anything in the case. The question, the only question, finally, was what that love had believed it was doing. Iris arrived with the tea and sat down with the air of someone who had been intending to sit down for the last hour and was finally permitting herself. "You went to the pond this morning," she said. "Not a question. Leonard Peck was kind enough to show me." Iris arranged the sugar bowl. "He's been very thorough, that man. The hall records, the surgery, the county archive in Gloucester." She paused. "Dr. Old is not sleeping well, his wife told me." Miss Marple looked up. "Dr. Old? He's the GP now. Was the locum in 1974. The junior one who countersigned the death certificate. He's been the village doctor for 30 years, but he was here then too, as a young man." Iris said this with the precision of someone providing a footnote they consider important. "He's a decent man." Decent men who have done something they shouldn't have tend to carry it in a specific way. "They do," Miss Marple agreed. "He'll talk to someone eventually. He's been building up to it." Iris looked out the window. Whether he talks to that young constable or to someone more useful remains to be seen. She stood up, transaction complete, and went to the counter as the door opened and Nora Harker, apparently having decided that her undrunk cup required no further attendance, gathered her coat and stood. She would have left without speaking. Miss Marple could see the intention clearly, the angle of the body, the decisive way she'd taken up her bag. But she had to pass the window table to reach the door, and Miss Marple said, pleasantly and without particular emphasis, "Mrs. Harker, I was so glad to meet your husband yesterday. He spoke very warmly of your work." Nora stopped. She had a good face. Not beautiful, but honest, the kind of face that had decided years ago to dispense with the effort of concealment, and now wore its history plainly. She looked at Miss Marple with the sharp assessment. Miss Marple had noted the previous afternoon, the obstacle on familiar path look. "He mentioned you," Nora said. "The lady from St. Mary Mead. I hope not unfavorably. Something that was almost a smile. He said you were the sort of person who agreed with you in a way that made you feel you hadn't been agreed with at all." She paused. "That's not unfavorable. That's cautious. Your husband is a cautious man." Nora Harker looked at her for a moment with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously, measuring, deciding, arriving. Then she sat down, not in the chair across from Miss Marple, but in the one at a slight angle. The posture of someone who is not quite committing to a conversation, but is not quite refusing one either. "He didn't do anything wrong," she said. "Not in the way that matters legally. I want that to be understood." "I think that may well be true," Miss Marple said. "He found her." He was. Geoffrey had feelings for Rosalind Peck that were not reciprocated, and he had finally persuaded her to meet him privately that evening, and when he arrived she was already in the water and she was dead. Nora said, all of this with the flat precision of a woman reciting something she has rehearsed, not because she is lying, but because the truth requires rehearsal to be said aloud. He panicked. He was 22, and he had an obsessive attachment to a woman who had just been found dead at a meeting he had arranged, and he moved her, slightly, he said, and then went to raise the alarm. And at the inquest he said he had been walking in that direction and seen nothing. And you have known this for 30 years. He told me on our 10th anniversary, which was not a choice I would have endorsed. A pause. The almost smile again drier. He told me because he could not stop telling me, I think. Some things press outward no matter what you do. Yes, Miss Marple said, they do. He didn't kill her. He was a foolish, obsessive young man who made everything worse and has been paying for it privately ever since. I am not asking you to feel sorry for him. I'm simply telling you the facts because—" She stopped, looked at the window, looked back. "Because I think you're going to find out what happened, and I would rather you found it out completely than partially. Partial knowledge does specific damage." Miss Marple thought about this. Then she said, carefully, "Is there something you know, Mrs. Harker, that you believe Leonard Peck's investigation would not find on its own?" Nora was quiet for a moment that had weight to it. "I know," she said finally, "that Geoffrey, when he arrived at the pond, did not find Rosalind Peck alone. He found her in the water, and the bank on the far side was still disturbed. The soft ground, she said the marks were still fresh, and there was no one there." She paused. "He has always said he saw no one. He saw no one running, no one on the path, but the ground on the south bank was disturbed. He told me that once, only once, and then he said he didn't know what it meant, and he wasn't going to say something he couldn't prove." She stood again, this time with finality. "I don't know what it means either. I only know it has never quite left him. She left, quickly, this time without looking back." Miss Marple sat with her cooling tea and looked out through Iris's amber-tinted window at the high street, which offered her, in the middle distance, the unremarkable sight of a woman walking home with shopping. Unhurried, ordinary, containing nothing of interest. She looked for slightly longer than the sight warranted. Then she looked down at her scone, which she had not eaten, and thought about South Banks and disturbed ground, and the difference between seeing no one and finding evidence that someone had been. Geoffrey Harker had not seen the person, but the person had been there. The person had been there on the South Bank in the soft September ground, and had left before Geoffrey arrived, had perhaps seen Geoffrey coming along the path from the village, and had time, just enough time to be gone. Someone who knew the pond, someone who knew which bank to use, someone who knew that the South Bank, with its steep drop and soft ground, was the place to be unseen from the path. Someone who had walked to that pond on autumn evenings many times before. Miss Marple picked up her cup and found it had gone quite cold. She drank it anyway, looking out at the ordinary high street, the ordinary village, the ordinary October afternoon. And she thought about what it meant to love someone so completely and so wrongly that you could stand on a dark bank in September and believe with your whole heart that you were doing the most important and necessary and loving thing that had ever been asked of you. She thought about the space between that belief and the letter that had been written 3 weeks before, the space between what had been agreed and what had changed. The space in which a woman had found a reason to stay and had not yet had time to say so. It was not a large space in terms of time. 3 weeks, perhaps less. It was an enormous space in terms of everything else. She set down her cup, straightened her back, and decided that tomorrow she would call on Dr. Old. Geoffrey Harker's cottage sat at the lane's end, where the village stopped pretending to be organized, and admitted it was simply a collection of old buildings arranged by habit rather than plan. The cottage itself was low-fronted and well-maintained in the way of a man who had spent his career assessing property and could not stop assessing his own. The gate recently rehung, the pointing fresh, the garden put to bed with the kind of thoroughness that left it looking disciplined rather than resting. A stone trough by the front door held the remains of summer geraniums, kept past their time by someone who found it difficult to accept that a thing was finished. Miss Marple had walked from the village alone, which Phillida had not endorsed but had eventually accepted, on the grounds that it was 10:30 in the morning, and the lane was flat, and Miss Marple's stick was perfectly adequate, and she had been managing her own movements for 82 years without significant mishap. Phillida had watched her from the gate with the expression of someone who has lost an argument and knows it. She rang the bell and waited. Geoffrey opened the door with the look of a man who had been expecting someone else and was not certain whether this was better or worse. He was in his indoor clothes, no wax jacket, a dark sweater going slightly at the elbows, and he looked, without the outdoor armor, both larger and less defended. "Miss Marple!" Flat, not unwelcoming. "Nora's at the studio." "I know. I came to speak to you, if you have a few minutes." He looked at her for a moment with the assessing look, the same property evaluation she had observed at the hall, and then stood back and let her in. The interior of the cottage was Nora's. Miss Marple understood immediately. Not in any dramatic sense. Geoffrey's presence was there, in the good shoes by the door and the ordnance survey maps on the hall wall, but the quality of the rooms was hers. The ceramics on every surface, all of them clearly her own work, in the particular palette of someone who understood Gloucestershire clay and what colors it wanted to be. Deep greens and ochres, and the occasional piece in a stark white that made the others look more themselves by contrast. The rooms were warm and slightly crowded, and the crowding felt intentional, felt like someone who had decided that fullness was preferable to space and had acted on this decisively for 30-odd years. Geoffrey brought her into the sitting room without asking whether she wanted tea, which she noted, and sat in the chair across from hers with his hands on his knees, in the posture of a man who has decided that the best approach to an uncomfortable situation is to be very still within it. "You've spoken to Nora," he said. "Briefly, yesterday. She told you what I told her." "Some of it," Miss Marple said. "I would rather hear the rest from you if you're willing. Not because I intend to carry it to Constable Morrow. I'm an old woman from St. Mary Mead with no standing whatsoever. But because I think you have been carrying something for 50 years that has got heavier rather than lighter. And the reason it has got heavier is that you have been carrying the wrong part of it." Geoffrey looked at her. Something in his face moved, not softening exactly, but a kind of shifting, the way a load shifts when the person carrying it changes their grip. "What do you mean, the wrong part?" he said. It was not quite a question. "You have been carrying the guilt of a young man who found a dead woman and panicked and said nothing. That guilt is real, and I don't dismiss it. But I think underneath it there is a different weight, which is the thing you noticed at the pond that evening and decided you could not say because you could not prove it. And that weight has increased with every year that has passed without being named." She paused. "I think the ground on the south bank was disturbed. And I think you know what that means, even if you never permitted yourself to say so." Geoffrey was very still. Outside, a wood pigeon was doing its repetitive, unhurried work in the lime tree at the garden's edge. The stone-trough geraniums, visible through the window, held their positions in the late morning light. "I was 22, he said. "I want you to understand what that means." 22, and I had feelings that I knew were not, that she had refused clearly, and I had arranged to meet her privately anyway, and she had agreed only to tell me finally and conclusively that it was the last such meeting she would allow. I knew that before I arrived. She had written to say so. He said all of this with the careful articulation of a man who has arranged these facts into their correct order many times. I was walking along the north path, and I could see from perhaps 30 feet that there was something at the water's edge on the south side. It was not dark yet, late evening, still light enough. I saw her in the water. I ran round the way in from the south end, where the ground is firmer, and I went in and I pulled her out. You went in to my waist. The pond is not deep on that side. She was very close to the bank. He stopped. She was already gone. I knew that immediately. There was no question. He looked at his hands. I pulled her out and I set her on the bank, and I stood there for what felt like a very long time, and then I looked at the ground. What did you see? 2 sets of marks in the soft ground. Her shoes. She had low shoes, sensible ones, going to the water's edge in one place directly, not stumbling, and another set larger, going to the edge and coming back quickly. The stride was longer coming back. You could see that, the distance between the marks. He paused, and the marks going back, they went toward the east end of the pond, toward the path that comes around through the far field. Not the village path, the field path. Someone who knew the alternative route. Someone who knew the pond well enough to know there was one. He looked up. I stood there and I looked at those marks, and I thought about what it would mean to say what I was seeing. I thought about the fact that I was there, that I had arranged the meeting, that she had gone out that evening and I had asked her to, that there was no version of that story, no version in which I did not appear to be the person most likely to have. He stopped. "You were afraid," Miss Marple said, simply, without judgment. "I was afraid," he said. "Yes, I was 22, and I was afraid, and I moved her slightly. I don't know why, some instinct I cannot explain, and I covered the marks on the south bank as well as I could with my own feet, going back and forth. And then I went round to the north path, and I walked to the nearest house and said I had found her." He looked at the window. I have never in my life done anything I am more ashamed of. Not the covering of the marks, Miss Marple said. The 50 years of silence after. Yes, quiet, definite. The 50 years. The wood pigeon continued its work outside. Miss Marple looked at the ceramics on the mantelpiece. 3 bowls in deep green, placed with the care of someone who understood that objects had a correct relationship to one another, and thought about what it meant to live in a house full of beautiful things made by a person who had decided 30 years ago to stay. The larger footmarks, she said, going to the water and returning. You covered them with your own, as best I could, but you saw them clearly before you covered them. Yes, a woman's shoes or a man's. Geoffrey was quiet for a moment that had a specific quality. Not reluctance, but the quality of someone arriving at something they have never said aloud. Smaller than mine, but not a small foot. Medium, perhaps. Flat shoe. Practical. He paused. I have thought about those marks more times than I can count. I have thought about who in this village wore flat practical shoes and knew the East Field path and knew the pond well enough too. He stopped himself. I did not let myself finish that thought. For 50 years I did not let myself finish it. Because finishing it meant saying it, Miss Marple said. And saying it meant everything that followed. Yes. Miss Marple looked at the geraniums in the stone trough through the window. Past their time. Kept on anyway. I am going to ask you something, she said, and I want you to answer it as directly as you are able, because I think you are, at bottom, a direct man who has been living indirectly for a very long time and finding it exhausting. She paused. If I told you that I believe I know whose footmarks those were, if I told you that I believe I can demonstrate by other means what happened at that pond, would you be willing to tell Constable Morrow what you have told me this morning? Geoffrey Harker looked at her for a long time. The wood pigeon moved to another branch. The morning light shifted slightly, the way October light did, always reminding you it was on its way somewhere else. If you can show it was not my fault she was there, he said, then yes. If there's a version of that evening that doesn't begin with the meeting I arranged. The meeting you arranged, Miss Marple said gently, brought you to the pond. It did not bring Rosalind Peck there. She was brought there by something else entirely. Something that had nothing to do with you, and everything to do with a decision that had been made, and then unmade, and then made again by someone who did not know it had been unmade. Geoffrey looked at her with the expression of a man hearing for the first time a sentence that reorganizes the furniture of 50 years. She didn't fall, he said. Not a question. Not quite. No, Miss Marple said. She didn't fall. She rose with the assistance of her stick, and Geoffrey rose with her automatically, the instinctive courtesy of a man of his generation, and she thought that he had been, under the obsession and the cowardice and the 50 years of strategic silence, probably a decent enough person. Decency did not preclude any of it. That was one of the things that made human situations so persistently difficult. At the door she paused. The stone trough, she said. The geraniums. Whose are they? Mine, Geoffrey said with a slight surprise. I always do the trough. Nora does the back garden. The trough is mine. They've gone over, Miss Marple said. But you haven't taken them out. No. He looked at them. Not yet. No, Miss Marple agreed, as though this were entirely natural, and went out through the rehung gate into the lane. The gate on Butter Lane was a simple wooden one, painted green some years ago, and not repainted, since the color fading to the particular gray-green of something that has been outside in English weather for longer than intended. It hung correctly now. Gerald from the hall had seen to it 2 days prior, with Phillida's diplomatic management of the reason. And Sylvia Capel had thanked Phillida briefly and without excessive warmth, in the manner of a woman who accepts practical assistance as a transaction rather than a kindness. Miss Marple had come alone. This had required a more sustained negotiation with Phillida than the walk to Geoffrey's cottage, because Phillida felt strongly that calling on Sylvia Capel, unannounced and unaccompanied, was a different category of venture from a morning walk down a flat lane. Miss Marple had agreed that it was a different category entirely, which was precisely why she needed to do it alone, and had eventually prevailed by suggesting that Phillida go to the hall to sit with Arthur, and that they meet for lunch at 1 o'clock, which gave Phillida something to do, and gave Miss Marple 2 hours that were entirely her own. She went through the green gate and up the short path and rang the bell. Sylvia Capel answered quickly, as though she had been in the front room. She was 74, and she looked it in the way that some people looked their age, not diminished by it, but arrived at it. The face settled into what it had always been tending toward. She was above average height, still straight, with gray hair cut practically, and eyes of an indeterminate color that had the quality Miss Marple associated with people who had spent their lives assessing other people's conditions, a steadiness that was not coldness, but was not warmth either, the steadiness of someone trained to observe rather than react. She looked at Miss Marple on her doorstep with that steadiness. "Miss Marple," she said. "Phillida Salt's friend." "Yes. I'm sorry to arrive without telephoning. I was walking on the lane and I thought, I've been hoping to meet you properly. Phillida speaks very well of you." All of this was true, more or less, in the way that many things used as cover were true, not false, simply doing additional work. Sylvia considered her for a moment. Then she stood back. "Come in." The cottage was narrow and longer than it appeared from outside. A sitting room at the front, a kitchen at the back, visible through an open door, a staircase rising steeply from the small hallway. It was clean and ordered in the way of someone for whom order was not a domestic preference but a professional habit that had outlasted the profession. Nothing unnecessary on surfaces. Objects placed with function rather than decoration in mind. And yet it was not a cold house. The sitting room had a fire laid but not lit. It was not quite cold enough for fires yet, or not cold enough by Sylvia Capel's reckoning, and the walls had shelves of books that had clearly been read, their spines creased, and their arrangement chronological rather than aesthetic, the organization of a reader rather than a displayer. On the windowsill, in a plain earthenware pot, was a single late-flowering plant that Miss Marple did not immediately identify, its small purple flowers still holding in the October light with the stubborn vitality of things that had not been told to finish. Martin Capel was in the kitchen. This was unexpected. He appeared in the doorway with a dish-towel in his hand, slightly surprised but recovering quickly. "Miss Marple, I thought you were." He glanced at his mother. "I'm just washing up. Come through if you like, there's tea," Sylvia said. "Sit down, Martin." "I'll do it." And to Miss Marple, "Sit, please." She went to the kitchen with the ease of a woman in complete ownership of her space, and Miss Marple sat in the chair nearest the window. The chair, she suspected, that was not Sylvia's usual chair, which would be the one beside the fire, and Martin Capel sat on the small sofa across the room and looked at her with the careful eyes she remembered from the hall. "I didn't know you were visiting today," he said. "Not accusatory. Simply noting I was passing," Miss Marple said. He accepted this with the expression of someone who does not believe it, but recognizes that not believing it will not change anything. He turned the dish-towel in his hands, the same rotating motion of thought she had observed before, and looked at the kitchen door, then back at her. "She's been quiet this week," he said low. "More than usual. I came down an extra time." "That was good of you." "She wouldn't say it was." The The dry, almost smile that was his mother's, Miss Marple noticed, placed slightly differently on a younger face. "She's not a woman who admits to needing company. She would say she enjoys my visits, not that she requires them, and she would mean the distinction. Self-sufficient people," Miss Marple said, "often require company the most. They have simply never built the habit of admitting it." Martin looked at her and then looked away, at the shelves of red books, as though something there required examination. "The hall cupboard," he said quietly. "You heard what I said at the hall about the hall cupboard. You said she keeps everything. Nursing notebooks. I said it knowing you'd heard it." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know why I said it. I've been." He stopped, started again. "I found a letter years ago in her things when I was helping her move some boxes. Not addressed to me, not open, sealed, addressed to Rosalind Peck, never sent. I put it back. I've never read it, and I've never mentioned it, and I've thought about it." He looked at the kitchen door again. "I've thought about it more this week than in the past 5 years." Miss Marple said nothing. "Whatever is in that cupboard," Martin said, "I think it will tell you what you need to know. I think that is why I told you about it." He folded the dish towel carefully and set it on the sofa arm. "I think my mother is a person who does not destroy things because she believes things should be witnessed, even things that cannot be spoken." Sylvia came back with a tray, 3 cups, a teapot, a small plate of plain biscuits, and set it on the low table with the practiced economy of someone who had performed this action 10,000 times. She sat in the chair by the unlaid fire, poured without asking how anyone took their tea, and distributed cups with the confidence of someone who had observed people long enough to know their preferences without inquiring. She had given Miss Marple hers with a splash of milk and no sugar, which was correct. Miss Marple accepted it with the small warmth of genuine appreciation and said, "Your garden is beautiful even now. That plant in the window, I can't place it." "Meadow saffron," Sylvia said. "Colchicum autumnale. It flowers after the leaves are gone. The leaves come in spring and die back in summer, and then in autumn the flowers arrive alone, without any foliage." She looked at the pot without particular expression. "People call it naked ladies. I've always found it a rather elegant arrangement. The flower doesn't need the leaves to be present in order to do what it does." "Quite extraordinary," Miss Marple said. She drank her tea and talked with Sylvia Capel for 20 minutes about the garden, about the late season, about the pharmaceutical history of colchicum, which Sylvia produced with the fluency of someone who had taught it, and about the botanical illustration work that had been done in the county, which Sylvia discussed with a knowledge that went considerably beyond casual interest. She spoke about Rosalind Peck's work once, briefly, in the context of the Wildflower Survey. She said the plates she completed were very fine, the medicinal species especially. She said it without any change in her voice whatsoever. It was the most controlled sentence Miss Marple had heard in a long career of listening to controlled sentences. Martin watched his mother while she said it, with the expression of someone listening for something beneath music. At 11:15, Sylvia said she had some correspondence to attend to, which was clearly a conclusion rather than an explanation, and rose with the finality of a woman who was used to managing the duration of things. Miss Marple rose also, with the appropriate expressions of gratitude, and Sylvia took the tray back to the kitchen with the dish towel. Martin walked Miss Marple to the door. In the narrow hallway she paused. The hall cupboard was to her left. A plain wooden door, painted white, the paint very slightly newer than the surrounding wall, repainted within the last few years, she estimated. The door was closed. On the shelf above it sat a small framed photograph, the only photograph visible anywhere in the house, of a woman in her late 20s. outdoors, half turned from the camera, looking at something out of frame. Dark hair, slight build, the particular quality of someone caught rather than posed, the reality of a person rather than the performance of one. She was holding what appeared to be a notebook. Miss Marple looked at the photograph for a natural moment. The moment a visitor's eye would naturally rest on the only photograph in a hallway, and then looked away. "Thank you for the tea," she said to Martin. He nodded. He had followed her gaze to the photograph and back, and he said nothing about it, and she said nothing about it, and the unspoken thing between them was, she felt, a form of agreement. Outside through the green gate and onto Butter Lane, the October morning was very still. She stood for a moment before beginning the walk back, leaning lightly on her stick, looking at nothing in particular. Meadow saffron, colchicum autumnale, the flower that arrived without its leaves. That did what it needed to do without the supporting structures that one would normally expect to be present. It was also, she reflected, had been since classical antiquity, was in every reference she had ever encountered, significantly toxic. Colchicine, its active compound, was colorless and tasteless in solution. It had been used medicinally in controlled doses for gout and other inflammatory conditions since the ancient Greeks. In the hands of a trained nurse, it was not exotic knowledge. It was the kind of knowledge that arrived in the ordinary course of a professional education and stayed. It would not, she thought, have been the mechanism. Not directly. Colchicine's effects were slow. Hours, not minutes. It was not what one used if one intended a drowning to look like a drowning, but something in warm liquid, tasteless, colorless, producing drowsiness and slowed response within 20 minutes. Something from a district nurse's pharmaceutical access. Something that would have dissipated or gone unlooked for in a cold pond in 1974 was the mechanism. Had always been the mechanism. She had known this since Martin mentioned the nursing notebooks, and she had thought about the tea that Sylvia made before guests had even sat down, the tea that was always waiting. She began the walk back to the village slowly, thinking about the cupboard she had not opened, about nursing notebooks in which a careful professional notation of controlled substances, disposal dates and ampoule counts would sit in the handwriting of a 24-year-old woman. The same handwriting, she imagined. 40 years later, the same careful formations, the same professional habit that did not destroy things because things should be witnessed. She thought about whether she needed to open that cupboard at all. She thought about what Martin Capel had said. "I think my mother is a person who does not destroy things because she believes things should be witnessed." She thought that there was, in that sentence, something that went beyond a son's assessment of his mother's habits. There was something that sounded, if one listened to it carefully, like permission. Not to break in, not to take, simply to know, simply to look. She would, she decided, come back. She would come back when Martin was here and Sylvia was briefly elsewhere, and Martin would find a reason to show her something in the garden, and she would find a reason to remain inside for a moment, and she would open a plain white cupboard door, and she would look at what was witnessed there, and then she would close it precisely as she had found it. She turned out of Butter Lane into the High Street, and walked toward Phillida's cottage in the thin October sun, and she thought that the hardest part of what was coming was not finding the evidence. The hardest part was going to be the conversation. Dr. Terence Ould's surgery occupied a converted Victorian villa on the village's north side, set back from the road behind a low wall with a brass plate so old the lettering had gone smooth in places, the name readable only if you already knew what it said. The building had the particular quality of somewhere that had absorbed decades of other people's anxiety. the waiting room chairs worn at the arms in the specific way of rooms where people sat and did not know what they were about to be told, the magazines on the low table recent enough to be current and old enough to suggest that nobody had thought about them in particular. Miss Marple had telephoned that morning, speaking to the receptionist with the mild persistence of someone who understood that an appointment for a routine matter. A slight stiffness in the hip, entirely genuine, could be arranged without difficulty. She had been given 4:15. She arrived at 4:10 and sat in the worn chair nearest the window and watched the receptionist close up the front desk at 4:30, put on her coat, and leave with the cheerful finality of someone whose day was structurally complete, regardless of what remained. At 4:35, Dr. Auld opened the door to the corridor himself and said, "Miss Marple, come through." He was 67, with the face of a man who had slept badly for a sustained period. Not this week, not this month, but as a condition. His hair had gone entirely white, and he wore it slightly too long in the way of men who had stopped attending to certain things at some point and maintained that position out of habit. He was a careful doctor, she judged immediately. His room was organized in the way of someone who used it with precision, instruments in their correct positions, notes arranged by a system, nothing spare. A careful doctor with an untidy conscience, which was its own particular kind of suffering. He took her details efficiently, examined her hip with the attentive competence of someone genuinely interested in what he was doing, said that some continued stiffness at this time of year was entirely expected and that she should keep walking, which she had no intention of stopping, and then sat back and looked at her with the expression of a man who has completed the official portion of an encounter and is waiting to see what the unofficial portion will require of him. "Your Philidor friend," he said, "from St. Mary Mead. Yes, you've been spending time with Leonard Peck. We have spoken several times. He's a thoughtful man, Doctor." Auld looked at his desk. He had a pen in his hand that he was not using for anything, holding it the way people held objects when their hands needed occupation. "Iris Fellows told my wife you were the sort of person who found things out. Iris is generous. She's accurate, I think." He set the pen down, picked it up again. "I have been expecting someone to come and speak to me for 40 years. I had imagined it would be a police officer." He paused. "I find I'm not disappointed that it isn't." Miss Marple said nothing and let the silence do its work. "I was 26 in 1974, he said. A locum covering Dr. Fenwick's practice for 6 months while he recovered from a cardiac episode. I had been qualified for 2 years. I was not inexperienced for my age, but I was new to the specific experience of being the junior person in a room where a decision was being made that I believed was wrong. The inquest. Before the inquest. The initial examination." He looked at the window, which showed the empty car park and the low wall and the lane beyond going dark in the early evening. "Doctor." Fenwick was the examining physician at the scene. I attended as his locum. She had been pulled from the water by Harker, we understood, though he said little enough about it. And Doctor. Fenwick examined her on the bank and said it was a drowning, consistent with the known illness, and that was the shape of things from that point. He paused. "I did not agree. What did you observe that caused disagreement?" "2 things." He said it with the precision of a man who has catalogued this information so many times it had achieved the character of formal evidence in his own mind. The first was her position. She had been pulled out on the north bank. If she had gone in from the north bank path, where the fence is, where the walking is, she would have been found in the water very close to where she went in. Still water in September. She should have been within 20 feet of the point of entry. Instead, she was found on the opposite bank, in the reeds, the south side. He looked at Miss Marple. I raised this with Dr. Fenwick. He said bodies moved in water unpredictably, and I was not yet experienced enough to make that judgment. He said it with the tone he used when he wished to conclude a discussion. And the second thing, Dr. Old was quiet for a moment. The pen made a small rotation in his fingers. She had been ill. Pancreatic cancer, we knew this. She had seen a specialist in Cheltenham. Her condition would have caused weakness, some loss of physical coordination in the later stages. But she had walked to the pond, a 12-minute walk from the village, which suggested a degree of function inconsistent with very advanced deterioration. He paused. When I examined her, her muscle tone there was a quality to the relaxation of the musculature that I found unusual. Not unusual for drowning, necessarily, but unusual in combination with the position, and unusual in the context of an illness that produces specific neurological effects rather than the general heaviness I observed. You thought she had been sedated. He looked at her steadily. I thought it was possible. I thought the combination of factors, position, muscle presentation, the specific quality of yes. I thought it was possible. He put the pen down finally, with the deliberateness of someone making a decision. I said so to Dr. Fenwick. I said I thought a toxicological examination would be prudent. He said I was a young doctor looking for complexity where there was none, that the family had enough to bear, and that a woman in her condition, walking alone in the evening, finding herself too weak to manage the bank, was a tragedy but not a mystery. He paused. He was 28 years my senior, and I was 6 weeks from the end of my locum, and I needed a reference. So you countersigned. I countersigned. The words arrived with the flatness of something said many times privately and never aloud. I countersigned, and I have thought about it on an average, I am not exaggerating, of once a week for 40 years. Not every week, some weeks more. He looked at his hands. I came back to this village in 1992 when Dr. Fenwick retired, and I took the practice. And I have wondered every year since whether I came back because I wanted to atone for something, or simply because it was a good practice in a pleasant village and I was tired of a city surgery. I have never satisfactorily resolved that question. The toxicological question, Miss Marple said. If a sedative had been administered in the circumstances of 1974, the illness, the cold water, the examination conducted in the field, what would have been detectable, and what would not? Doctor. Auld looked at her with an expression that was not surprise. He had been a doctor for 40 years, and surprise required specific conditions, but something close to relief, the relief of a question being asked directly. A barbiturate in significant quantity would likely have been detectable even then, in a proper post-mortem examination. But a smaller dose, a therapeutic dose, the kind used for anxiety or insomnia, something prescribed and used in proper clinical practice, in combination with cold water, in a body not examined until the following morning by a coroner who had already determined the cause of death. He stopped. The answer is that a careful, small dose of something appropriate, administered by someone who understood dosage, would likely not have been found, particularly if no one was looking. A district nurse, Miss Marple said. In 1974, what would her access to sedatives have been? The question sat between them in the quiet room, Doctor, Old said, after a moment. A district nurse in 1974 carried a controlled drugs register, a small notebook in which every controlled substance she administered or disposed of was recorded by date, quantity, and patient name. The records were checked periodically by the supervising GP. He paused. The system relied very substantially on professional honesty. A nurse who wished to record a disposal that had not occurred, or to record an administration to one patient that had in fact gone elsewhere, would have found it In a busy rural practice with intermittent supervision, quite straightforward to do. And if those notebooks were kept, if they were kept, he said, and if the entries for September 1974 were examined by someone who knew what they were looking for, a disposal entry for a sedative compound on a date without a corresponding patient record, or an administration entry for a patient who was not, in fact, administered anything, that would constitute a significant discrepancy. He paused. It would not be proof of what the substance was used for, but it would be proof that something had been misrecorded, and in the context of everything else it would be. He stopped. "Sufficient," Miss Marple said. "Sufficient," he agreed. She had seen it, 3 weeks ago, in Sylvia Capel's hall cupboard, with Martin standing in the kitchen and the sound of Sylvia's footsteps moving toward the back door to look at something in the garden. The something being a question from Miss Marple about the late flowering clematis on the south wall, asked with the specific purpose of producing 2 minutes of solitude. 2 minutes was enough. She had opened the cupboard, found the notebooks arranged by year on the second shelf, taken down 1974, and found it in 40 seconds because she had known precisely what she was looking for. September 12, 1974. Disposal chloral hydrate, 2 example, Controlled Drugs Register Ref, CDR 740912. The notation was clean and precise, in the handwriting she had expected. Careful, professional, formed with the same hand that had made thousands of similar entries. There was no patient name. There was no patient name because the disposal entry was not attached to a patient. It was attached to nothing, floating in the record as a notation without a referent, the bureaucratic trace of something that had happened outside the system. Chloral hydrate, the oldest sedative in clinical use. Colorless, tasteless solution. Effective in 20 to 30 minutes. Historically administered in liquid, in drink. Historically associated, in the popular imagination, with the phrase knocked out cold, because that was essentially what it did. It did not produce the heaviness of barbiturates. It produced a rapid and complete sedation. In a woman already weakened by illness, in September 1974, she had closed the notebook and replaced it with the precision she had promised herself. Returned to its position, the slight lean it had carried reproduced exactly, and had gone out through the back door and asked Sylvia a genuine question about the clematis, because the clematis was, in fact, very fine. She had not told anyone what she had found. She had carried it from that day to this, 4 days, and she had slept on it, and she had thought about it with the thoroughness she gave to things that required thoroughness. And she had decided that what she was going to do with it would depend entirely on the conversation she was about to have. "Dr. Old," she said, "if I told you that I had seen the entry, that the entry exists, in the 1974 Controlled Drugs Register, in Sylvia Capel's nursing notebooks, would you be willing to make a formal statement to that effect? That you observed in your professional capacity reasons to request a toxicological examination, and that your request was overruled?" Dr. Ould was very still. "It would not make pleasant reading," Miss Marple said, "your part in it." "No," he said, "it would not, but it would be the truth. It would be the complete truth, yes, including my cowardice." He looked at the worn desk, the ordered instruments, the window going fully dark now. "I have been a decent doctor for 40 years. I have been, I think, a good doctor for the last 20. I have tried to balance what I left undone here against what I've done since." He looked up. "I don't think it balances. I have never thought it balanced." "No," Miss Marple said with great gentleness, "I don't suppose it does. But a statement, made now, completely and honestly, that would be something on the other side of the scale." Dr. Ould looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his desk drawer and produced a legal pad and uncapped a pen, a different pen, one that was for using, and set them in front of him with the deliberateness of a man who has made a decision he should have made a long time ago and has finally found the moment. "Tell me," he said, "what you need the statement to contain." Outside, the lane was fully dark. The brass plate on the wall was invisible in the evening, the name gone smooth and unreadable, as it had been for years. Inside, under the surgery light, an old woman and an old doctor sat together, and between them the shape of 50 years of undone things began slowly and carefully to be done. She read the letter again that morning. Phillida had gone to the hall at 9. Arthur was having a difficult week, the kind of slow difficult that old age produced, not dramatic, simply a dimming. And Miss Marple sat alone in Phillida's sitting room with the copy Leonard had made for her. The 2 pages in Rosalind Peck's small, precise handwriting, and she read it as she had not read it before. Not for what it contained, for what it assumed. The letter assumed October. It assumed the wildflowers finishing and sitting inside properly, and the company of a mother who worried. It assumed the continuation of a correspondence that had been going on for years. It assumed, in its very construction, the easy reference to things said before, the mid-sentence quality of its intimacies, the way it picked up a thread rather than beginning one, that there was more time ahead than behind. I have a reason to stay, and I am going to stay as long as I am able. She had told Leonard she thought this meant life itself. She believed this still. But she sat now with the letter, and she thought about the specific situation from which the sentence had emerged. A woman who had made an agreement she no longer wanted to keep, who had found something that returned the future to her, who had not yet told the person she needed to tell. The person she needed to tell. There was the wound, if one wanted to call it that. Not malice, not possession, not the kind of darkness that made for straightforward cases. The wound was in the gap between what had been agreed and what had changed. And the gap was 3 weeks wide, and in those 3 weeks Rosalind Peck had written to her mother and had not written to Sylvia, and Miss Marple had been thinking about why. She thought she knew why. Because telling Sylvia required a conversation, not a letter. Because what had changed was not a fact that could be transmitted in writing. It was something that needed to be said face to face. Something that needed Sylvia's presence and Sylvia's response and the working out that happened between 2 people in a room together. Rosalind had been building toward that conversation. She had not had time to have it. And Sylvia, who had been preparing for months, who had organized her entire interior life around what she believed was coming, who had made in her own mind a promise she intended to keep, had not known the conversation was waiting. Miss Marple folded the letter back along its creases and set it on the table. She put on her coat and her good walking shoes and took her stick from the stand by Phillida's door and went out into the October morning. Butter Lane was quiet. The green gate stood correctly on its rehung hinges. The garden was empty, the late-flowering things holding their positions in the thin light. Miss Marple went through the gate and up the path and rang the bell and waited. Sylvia Capel opened the door and looked at her without surprise. "Miss Marple," she said, "I'm sorry to come without telephoning. I was hoping you might have a few minutes." Sylvia looked at her for a long moment with the steady assessing eyes. Then she stood back as she had before. "Martin isn't here today." "I know," Miss Marple said. Something moved in Sylvia's expression. Something very small, a fractional shift. The movement of a person who has received a confirmation rather than a surprise. She turned and led Miss Marple through to the sitting room, and the fire was lit this time. The morning cold enough finally, the room warmer and smaller for it. The meadow saffron on the windowsill had its flowers still. 3 or 4 of them, the purple a little deeper in the firelight. Sylvia did not go to the kitchen. She sat in her chair by the fire and folded her hands in her lap with the composure of someone who has been expecting a specific thing for a long time and has decided that when it arrives she will meet it without performance. Miss Marple sat across from her and set her stick against the chair arm and looked at the fire for a moment before she spoke. She did not accuse. She had known since Geoffrey's cottage how she would do this. She would describe, not accuse. She would lay out the shape of what she understood and let Sylvia occupy it or refuse it, and the occupying or refusing would tell her what she needed to know. "I want to tell you," she said, "what I believe happened on the 14th of September 1974. Not what I can prove. Some of it I can prove, some of it I can only understand. I would like you to listen and to tell me when I am wrong, and I will try to be precise." Sylvia said nothing. She was looking at her own hands. "Rosalind Peck had a terminal diagnosis," Miss Marple said. "She had known it for some months. She told you because you were the person she told the things that mattered. You had been for 2 years the central person in her life, and she had been the central person in yours." She paused. "You made a plan together, as people sometimes do when they are faced with a death that will be slow and difficult. Rosalind did not want the death her illness was going to give her. She asked you as a nurse, as the person who loved her most, to help her when the time came. And you agreed, because it was the most important thing anyone had ever asked you, and because you understood what she was asking, and because the idea of her suffering in the way that illness would produce was unbearable to you." The fire made its small sounds. Sylvia's hands did not move. "What I believe happened in the weeks before September was that Rosalind changed her mind. Something shifted. Perhaps the illness itself. There are documented cases of terminal patients experiencing a clarity, a return of will, that is not well understood but is well observed. Perhaps something simpler. A conversation, a morning, a particular quality of light on the wildflowers she had spent 2 years drawing. She found, as she wrote to her mother, a reason to stay." Miss Marple paused. "She did not tell you. I think she meant to tell you. I think she was building toward that conversation, the specific face-to-face conversation that such a thing required. I think she had perhaps begun to find the words." Sylvia's hands tightened slightly, a single movement, then still again. "You did not know she had changed her mind," Miss Marple said. "I want to be accurate about that. What you did on the evening of the 14th you did in the belief that you were fulfilling a promise, that Rosalind had asked this of you, and you were honoring it. You put chloral hydrate in her evening tea, a small dose, a nurse's dose, enough to slow her responses and make the water easier, and you walked with her to the pond, as you had walked many times before, and you held her in the water until she was gone. And then you took the Eastfield path back, because you knew the pond, because you had walked it in all seasons, and you went home and you grieved for the woman you had just lost in the way you believed she had asked you to lose her." The room was very quiet. The fire, the meadow saffron on the sill. "You did not know," Miss Marple said, "about the letter she had written to her mother 3 weeks before, telling her she intended to fight, telling her she had a reason to stay." She paused. "I think you may have seen her writing a letter. I think you chose not to ask what it said." Sylvia looked up. It was the first time she had looked up since Miss Marple began speaking, and the look was not what Miss Marple had expected. Not guilt, not grief in the conventional sense, not the crumpling that innocent people sometimes produced, and guilty people sometimes performed. It was a look of extraordinary stillness, the look of someone who has lived for 50 years with a thing and has arrived in this moment at the last room of it. "I saw her writing," Sylvia said. Her voice was what it had always been, measured, uninflected, the voice of someone trained to deliver information without the distortion of feeling. I was in the kitchen. She was at the table by the window. She wrote for a long time. She paused. I told myself it was family correspondence. I told myself it was nothing to do with our arrangement. But you didn't ask. The silence that followed was the longest of the morning. Outside, a car passed on the lane, slowed, went on. No, Sylvia said. I didn't ask. Miss Marple looked at the fire. She thought about Mrs. Forrest and the windows kept closed and the friend from Cirencester who never came. She thought about the specific and terrible confidence of a love that had decided it already knew what was needed. I believed she wanted it, Sylvia said. I had believed it for months. I had prepared for it. It was the shape of everything I was doing. She paused. When I think about that evening, I do not think of it as, I have never experienced it as, no, Miss Marple said quietly. I don't suppose you have. I thought I was giving her what she asked for. Yes, but she had changed her mind. Yes. Sylvia looked at her hands again. The firelight moved across her face with the slow indifference of firelight, which illuminated without distinction. I may have been wrong, she said. It came out quietly, without drama, without the collapse that the words, in other mouths, in other circumstances, might have produced. It came out as what it was. A sentence that had been true for 50 years without ever being spoken, arriving now into the room like something that had traveled a very long distance and was finally still. Miss Marple said nothing. She had changed her mind, Sylvia said again, and this time it was not quite the same sentence. This time it had the quality of something being understood rather than admitted. The quality of a person receiving, at 74, a fact that had been available to them for 50 years, and that they had, with great discipline and great suffering, declined to receive until now. The fire settled, a log shifted. The meadow saffron stood in its pot on the sill, with its purple flowers, doing what it did without the support of leaves, in the thin October light that was already, at 10:30 in the morning, beginning to think about the afternoon. Miss Marple rose. She did it slowly, with the assistance of her stick, and Sylvia rose also. The automatic courtesy, the same instinct that had risen in Geoffrey Harker, the residue of a certain kind of upbringing that persisted through everything. What happens now? Sylvia said, not with fear, with the tone of someone asking a practical question about a process they intend to go through correctly. Doctor, Auld has made a statement, Miss Marple said. He will give it to Constable Morrow today. The inquest will almost certainly be reopened. The Controlled Drugs Register for September 1974 will be examined. She paused. I think you know what it contains. Yes, Sylvia said. I know what it contains. There are people who will need to speak with you. Not today, I think, but soon. Sylvia nodded once, with the nod of a woman noting a deadline in a schedule. At the door, Miss Marple paused. She looked at the photograph in the hallway. Rosalind Peck half-turned, the notebook in her hand, the quality of someone caught in the middle of being herself. She looked at it for the natural moment, and then she looked at Sylvia, who was standing in the doorway to the sitting room and also looking at the photograph, with the expression that Miss Marple had, in 82 years, seen only rarely. The expression of someone who has loved something absolutely and lost it absolutely and has never, in all the years since, found anywhere adequate to put that fact. She was extraordinary, Sylvia said, to the photograph, not to Miss Marple. I believe she was, Miss Marple said. She went out through the green gate, which hung correctly on its new hinges, and on to Butter Lane, which was quiet in the October morning. And she walked back toward the village with her stick on the soft ground and the thin sun on her back, and the particular feeling she had carried out of difficult conversations for 80 years. Not satisfaction, Never satisfaction, but something quieter and less comfortable than that. The feeling of a true thing having been said in a room where it needed to be said. The feeling of a shape long distorted, returning to what it actually was. She did not walk quickly. There was no reason to walk quickly. The case, she thought, was over. What came after was not hers. The inquest was reopened on a Thursday. Miss Marple was not present. She was by that point back in St. Mary Mead, in her own sitting room with her own garden visible through the window, the late roses still making their case against the season, the lawn gone soft with autumn rain, the whole familiar composition of it settling around her like a coat put back on after a long time away. Phillida had telephoned with the news, and Miss Marple had listened and said the appropriate things, and after she put down the receiver, she sat for a while in the particular quiet of her own house and looked at nothing in particular. She had left Nether Wicken on the Friday, 5 days after the conversation on Butter Lane. 2 days after she had sat with Constable Morrow in Phillida's sitting room and told him, with the careful precision of someone who understood the difference between what she knew and what she could demonstrate, what the controlled drugs register would show, and what Dr. Old's statement contained, and what Geoffrey Harker would tell him if asked the right questions in the right order. Morrow had listened with the focused attention of a young officer who had begun the week thinking he was assessing a querulous solicitor, and was ending it understanding that something real had happened here 50 years ago, and that it was now unambiguously his to manage. He was a decent young man. Miss Marple had thought so from the first, and thought so more by the end. He had the quality she valued in anyone given authority over difficult situations. He was more interested in accuracy than in conclusion. He would do it correctly. Leonard Peck had come to Phillida's cottage on the Thursday evening, the day before Miss Marple left, and sat in the chair Geoffrey Harker had occupied in her mind for weeks. The visitor's chair, the chair of someone who had come to receive something. And Miss Marple had told him what she had found, and how, and what it meant. She told him carefully and completely, and she watched his face receive it. And the receiving was not simple and was not quick, and she did not try to make it either. He sat for a long time after she had finished. She had changed her mind, he said. Yes, and Sylvia didn't know. Sylvia did not know. She believed she was honoring what Rosalind had asked of her. Miss Marple paused. That is the truth as best I can determine it. It does not make what happened legal. It does not resolve what was taken from your sister, which was the future she had decided to fight for. But it is the truth, and I think you came here for the truth, and I wanted you to have it completely. Leonard looked at his hands. The solicitor's hands, she had noticed, always slightly ink-stained. The habit of a man who still wrote things out longhand before he typed them. He looked at them for a long time. Rosalind loved her, he said. Not a question. I believe so. Yes. And Sylvia loved Rosalind, without question. In the way that some people love, entirely, and with complete conviction about what the loved person needs. Which is its own kind of. She stopped. It is a very particular kind of love. It leaves very little room for the other person to change. Leonard was quiet. She was writing to tell Sylvia she'd changed her mind. The letter she never sent, the sealed one Martin found. That's what it is. I think so. She didn't have time. No, 3 weeks was not enough time. Miss Marple looked at the window, the October lane, the lime tree at the garden's end going bare. She had found her reason to stay. She simply had not yet had the conversation that would have made it matter. And that, the space between the finding and the saying, is where everything went wrong. Leonard Peck left an hour later. He shook her hand at the door. A formal, deliberate handshake, the kind that meant something, and said that he was grateful. and she could see that he meant it in the complicated way that gratitude for difficult truths was always meant. With relief and with grief simultaneously, the two things so thoroughly mixed they could not be separated. She had watched him walk down the lane toward the village with the walk of a man carrying something he would carry differently from now on. Not lighter, necessarily. Differently. The letter that Martin Capel read was never discussed with Miss Marple directly. She did not ask, and he did not offer. She learned through Phillida, who learned through the reliable mechanism of Iris Fellows, that Martin had sat with the sealed letter in his car outside his mother's cottage for 40 minutes before opening it, and that he had then driven away and not returned until the following day, and that when he came back he had sat with Sylvia for 3 hours, and they had not been heard to argue. What the letter contained remained between them. Miss Marple thought this was correct. Some things were witnessed not by being made public, but by being held. Kept, as Sylvia Capel kept things, in the faith that bearing them was its own form of honoring them. The letter had waited 30 years for the right moment, and it had found one. And what it said was now in the possession of the people who needed to have it. That was sufficient. That was perhaps exactly right. Geoffrey Harker gave his statement to Constable Morrow on the Wednesday morning, the morning after Miss Marple's conversation with Morrow, in a meeting that Nora attended and did not speak during, sitting beside her husband in the particular posture of a woman providing ballast rather than testimony. Geoffrey told it completely, including the South Bank and the marks, and the covering of the marks, and the 50 years of saying nothing. He told it with the flatness of someone reading from a document they have written and rewritten many times, and finally committed to final form. When he had finished, Morrow had said, Phillida reported this with the careful neutrality of someone transmitting information she found interesting. That Geoffrey's obstruction of the original investigation would need to be formally noted, but that given the circumstances and the passage of time, the practical implications were a matter for others to determine. Geoffrey had said, "Yes, I understand," and then, after a pause, "She was already there when I arrived. I want that in the record. Whatever else I did, she was already there." Morrow had said it would be in the record. Nora had said nothing. On the way out, she had thanked Morrow briefly for his time. It was the most precisely deployed politeness Miss Marple had heard in weeks. The practical legal question of what Sylvia Capel had done, and what 50-year-old evidence, in the absence of a surviving coroner or a surviving subject, could be made to demonstrate, was a question Miss Marple left entirely to those equipped to answer it. She was not a lawyer. She was not a police officer. She was an old woman from St. Mary Mead who had been visiting a friend and had noticed things, and her part in the matter was complete. She thought, in the weeks after her return, about what the law would make of it. She thought about the distance between what had happened and what could be proven, and the further distance between what could be proven and what could be prosecuted. She thought about the controlled drugs register and doctor, Old's statement and Geoffrey's account of the South Bank, and the space in which these three things, taken together, made a shape that could not easily be argued away. She did not think it would end in a courtroom. She thought it was more likely to end in a formal finding, a reopened inquest, a revised conclusion, something that put on record what the record had omitted, and that Sylvia Capel, at 74, with her careful composure and her hall cupboard full of witness things, would meet whatever came with the steadiness she had brought to everything else. Miss Marple did not know whether this was justice. She was not sure she had known at the end of any case whether what followed was justice. What she knew was whether it was true. The truth of what had happened in Netherwicken on a September evening in 1974 was now in the right hands, and it would go where it needed to go. And the people it touched most closely, Leonard, Martin, Geoffrey, Sylvia herself, would carry it in the ways they were equipped to carry it, which were not ways Miss Marple could predict or manage. That was, she had long understood, the precise limit of what she did. In the second week of November, a parcel arrived at St. Mary Mead. It was addressed in the handwriting she did not immediately recognize, and when she opened it, she found, wrapped in brown paper and tissue, a small ceramic bowl. Deep green, the particular green of Gloucestershire clay, in the hands of someone who understood it, with a quality of weight and proportion that made it feel, when she held it, like an object that had decided what it wanted to be and become it. There was a card. It said, "For your mantelpiece, if you'll have it, with thanks for accuracy. N. Harker." Miss Marple set the bowl on the mantelpiece between the clock and the small photograph of her nephew Raymond, and stood back and looked at it. It was a very good bowl. It occupied its space with the confidence of well-made things. She thought that Nora Harker was, in the end, a woman who expressed what she meant in the materials available to her rather than in words, and that the bowl was a precise and considered thing to send, and that she was glad to have it. On a morning in late November, cold now, properly cold, the first frost on the garden, Miss Marple sat in her own chair with her own tea and looked out at the roses, which had finally accepted the season and were doing nothing at all. And she thought about Netherwicken. She thought about Rosalind Peck, whom she had never met and knew only through a letter and a photograph, and the reports of people who had loved her, and who had been, by all available evidence, funny and precise and inconveniently clear-eyed, and not at all the gentle, melancholy figure the village had constructed in her absence. She thought that Rosalind would have found the village's version of her somewhat irritating, and that she would have said so, and that whoever she said it to would have been briefly taken aback, and then rather charmed. She thought about what 3 weeks meant, 3 weeks between finding a reason to stay and not having time to say so. She had thought about this intermittently since September, and she had not arrived at a way of thinking about it that made it easier, and she had decided that easier was not the point. The point was that it was true, and that it was now known, and that Rosalind Peck's decision, the decision she had made privately and was building toward saying aloud, was now part of the record. It was witnessed. She had not been able to say it herself, and now it was said, and Miss Marple thought that was something, even if it was not everything. She thought about Sylvia Capel sitting by her fire with her hands folded and her face receiving at 74 the fact she had carried for 50 years without fully permitting herself to hold it. She had changed her mind, said aloud, in a warm room, to another person, received at last. Miss Marple did not know what Sylvia would do with that receipt, whether it would produce something that resembled peace, or something that resembled the opposite of peace, or something more complicated than either. She thought probably the third. She thought that was appropriate. She thought about the meadow saffron on the windowsill, the flowers that came without their leaves, doing what they needed to do in the absence of ordinary support. She picked up her tea and looked at the garden, the bare roses, the frost-pale lawn, the whole familiar extent of it. Then she thought about something else entirely, because there was correspondence to attend to, and Raymond was coming for Christmas, and the garden would need its winter work begun. And she was 82 years old with a great deal still to do, and the dead kept their own time, and the living had to keep theirs.